Are the kids all right? Young people under the age of 35, are apparently the most miserable generation, but they're not all miserable in exactly the same way. And today's guest has dug into the 6 foundational tribes, which she says define young people, their attitude to life, their attitude to work, and their outlook for the future. These 6 tribes are very, very different, from far-left student activists to family values nationalists, from pragmatic strivers to affluent, already comfortable Nepo babies. But they have enough in common that we can glean from them the kinds of strains that they are going to put on politics and culture and society, and try to figure out how best to serve them and our countries. Parnell McGuinness is a columnist at the Sydney Morning Herald, the biggest broadsheet in Australia's biggest city. She's a senior fellow at the Centre for Independent Studies, and she's previously worked for Australia's centre-right party, the Australian Liberal Party, and also for the Greens in Germany. The latest report, which she's here to unpack, is called Generation Trapped: Housing, Handouts, and the Collapse of Young Australians' Life Satisfaction. I hope you enjoy as much as I did. The one, the only, Parnell McGuinness. How do you do a weekly column every single week for, it's been 6 years now that you've had a column in the biggest broadsheet in Sydney?
Well, with passion, that's how. I suppose I'm the kind of person who's constantly thinking about things and interested in things. And I keep a big, in Apple Notes, I have thousands and thousands of notes where I put down thoughts about various things. And sometimes it'll be a long-term interest. So I will save everything that I'm interested in that's related to a particular topic into one note. And sometimes it's just, something that comes up and I'll dash down a note. And now because there are so many notes in there, I've had to create a super organizer for that. So I have a column ideas app, which is just like a one-liner of the thing that is.
But it's still just a basic notes app. You're not using you're not putting it into some fancy AI to try to Notebook LM or something to try to make connections.
I have played with Notebook LLM just out of my own interest. I'm not expert enough in AI to use it to the best effect. I think that there's probably something interesting to be done in that field. I really think that AI capabilities are just growing every day, and I'm fascinated by them. I actually, in the research that we'll talk about, I'll tell you how I used AI in that in an interesting way. But yeah, I think that at the moment, people in the media use AI in exactly the wrong way, not like that, like you're suggesting, to make connections between them, but instead to edit the columns. And I have discovered that it has a cadence that
definitely.
Can absolutely recognize.
A lot of M dashes.
It's not just the M dashes. It's these sort of binary sentences. It's not this, it's that. Or it's not just policy. It's voting with consequence.
Yes. And it tries to give it'll have a long sentence and then it'll have a punchy summary that it thinks is really landing.
Except that the summary doesn't land. No. And a lot of the time it doesn't make any sense.
Yes.
And, if you read Kaufman, System 1 and 2, the thinking fast and slow.
Yeah.
So I always think about AI written things like this. They go straight through your System 1 and bypass System 2.
So and just explain the System 1 and System 2 thinking. It was Kahneman, right? Danny Kahneman.
Kahneman, that's right. Yeah. Thank you. So System 1 is the system, the brain which just accepts things based on rules. So, you might even call it the gut. It just feels right. And so you don't examine it any further. It's where the easy knowledge is stored, 2 times 2 equals 4 sort of thing. System 2 is where you have to examine things more deeply. And so if a problem is harder, the brain takes it out of System 1, puts it into System 2, and System 2 cogitates on it and therefore understands it more deeply and forms connections. Now, the problem with AI is because it does this sort of language which sounds so right, it bypasses, in my opinion, that System 2. And so you end up not noticing things which are just completely nonsensical.
Right.
Completely
or
wrong.
a little off. I
just,
was using it the last column that I wrote was about AI and about how the strain that the change as a result of AI is going to put on society is not being properly reckoned with. And I put it into Claude just to see what would happen.
Yeah.
And it is useful. Sometimes it comes up with, it says, you've actually already said this thing, in paragraph 3. You don't need to say it again in paragraph 8, which is great. But it came up with this punchline where I was talking about like apocalyptic social decline, and it said, Mad Max isn't a political parable, it's mathematics. And I thought, oh, that's a great line. And then I paused for a moment and thought, hang on, what does that mean?
What does it mean?
I mean, I think I know what it's getting at. Like, we will reliably end up in a terrible situation if we don't address it. But mathematics isn't the right thing. If you might say Mad Max isn't a political parable, it's human psychology or it's biology or something, but it's just a little
That's
off.
Right. And it's these sort of naff little sayings, exactly. And that's such a perfect example. So you read it when you're tired and you think, oh, gosh, that's great. Sounds fabulous. Yeah. But then this is why I will always sleep on it. If I've used AI to edit something or to draft something up, always sleep on it, because the next day when your brain is fresher and not just letting things pass through, you'll look at those lines and think, this is complete nonsense, or this is not what I meant at all, or it's stripped nuance out of things.
I mean, one thing that I am using it for more and more, which I'm amazed it's good at, is actually making connections that I haven't made. So not the writing or even the copy editing, but I turned it on the other day when I was in the car and just spoke to it verbally and had it talking back to me, had Claude talking back to me as I was trying to wrestle through exactly what I was trying to say about my next column. I was like, I think there's a bit of a problem in me trying to make this point because it kind of contradicts this other point. And it came up with a really neat like cognitive and logical solution, which and 6 months ago I would never have believed.
Well, but now it's essentially a really sophisticated Google that you've just used there, which I'm all for. Like a more sophisticated Google is an amazing tool because Google was an amazing tool.
But it's not just looking stuff up. It is making connections.
Well, that's right. But, it's just like Google allowed you to access information that previously wouldn't have been at your fingertips. Now AI is drawing connections between information in a way that wouldn't have been at your fingertips. So, people did think when Google first came on the scene that it was cheating you weren't going to the library, you were looking things. And of course, you do need to use it thoughtfully. You need to go deeper and not just use the front page results and things like that. But yeah, it is essentially a really powerful tool once you learn to use it properly. Yeah. That's what we're learning to do.
Yeah. And so just coming back to your column, have you noticed that there are, and leading up to your current research, that there have been fields in which you were initially uninterested in writing about that now you are, or vice versa, things that were interesting 5 years ago that are no longer on our radar?
I think that's always the case, though, isn't it? I mean, we always move through sort of periods of interest in various things. There are like the things that you're interested right now because they've come up, but I definitely have long-term themes, and I really notice this in my columns now. When you look back at a bank of columns, like obviously for me, what really emerges is feminism. I'm fascinated with feminism, what it means, what it's done to women, what the sexual revolution has meant for women. That always comes through again and again in different ways in my column. Immigration has been a big one because I lived in Berlin in the 2000s. I accidentally moved into the ghetto. So, nice white girl from a privileged background.
The ghetto of what? Well, where were the migrants from?
So, it was very heavily Turkish and Arab there. And it was, the thing is in Berlin, it's very confusing because this was not far from the city. So this was quite a central apartment. It just didn't occur to me. I was young, I was stupid. The apartment was very cheap. And I didn't think about why that might have been. And so I moved in there. It really was a great apartment, but it was an experience because we didn't have a washing machine or dryer. So I had to go down to the local Waschsalon, which had a bar attached to it. And as a result, while we were doing our washing, we'd get talking to the locals there. And I became friends with a lot of them. But they were definitely not people who I would have come across in any other situation.
Great.
So, I know. It was fabulous. It was fabulous. It was also an education, however, on what happens when you don't do integration right, that it actually harms the people who are not integrated. It's not like you can just provide them with welfare or provide them with an apartment and say, our job is done. The Germans always like to talk about human dignity. There is no human dignity in not being able to find your way into the workforce. And that was, in the end, what I realised with a lot of these guys. A lot of these young men felt very outside of the society because they didn't know how to do the basic things like getting themselves a job. So they would, become drug dealers or petty criminals or just give up a lot of the time, which is very sad. One of them, who was a very good friend, decided that he wanted to apply for the French Foreign Legion. And so he came to me and he said, "Can you help me with my CV?" And I was like, well, my German is, not perfect, but it's probably better than yours, which is another sort of indictment on things. So I helped him with that. We worked, and I was pretty much fluent by then. So I helped him with that. We worked on things, and then, and he put in his application, and it was rejected. And I will never forget just thinking, it's so heartbreaking that this guy isn't even skilled enough to be cannon fodder. He doesn't have the soft skills of being an employee. And that is something that we've taken away from him because we thought that simply giving people the material necessities is all that it takes for a good life.
And I mean, not to mention the fact that in Germany, if you're a Turkish migrant in Germany, I think you can almost never become a German citizen, right? I mean, there's there's a weird thing that Germans have about German ethnic citizenship.
So what you're talking about. So they actually do have citizenship. So especially the kids of the guest workers. So they have citizenship. Some of them are, not just second or third generation German. They're like, fourth or fifth. It's sort of.
But what are my friends in Berlin talking about when they're talking about? It's not like Australia, where after if you've been living in Australia on a residence visa for whatever it is, 6 years or 8 years or something, then you're eligible for citizenship. But in Germany, there's an ethnic component.
They're talking culturally.
Well.
So
right.
These people do actually have German citizenship.
But isn't there a guest worker program that the Turks live on for 30 years without being eligible?
Well, but then they became citizens. So, at some point, that finished in the 60s with not allowing them to become citizens. That was, people said, this is not okay. They want to stay here now. They've had kids here. Their life is here. We've got to give them citizenship. But they were never integrated properly. They were never taught German properly. Their kids weren't integrated properly in the schools. And so that has had knock-on multi-generational effects.
Do you think that we've escaped that in Australia? I mean, famously, as we look at the rise of the far right in Europe and the Alternative for Deutschland and, Marine Le Pen in France and Farage in the UK, a lot of us can sometimes be a bit smug saying, well, we don't have the banlieue of Paris and we don't have the towns in northern England where, English isn't spoken on the streets anywhere and the local police don't even feel that they can go in to sort things out because they're basically run by migrant fiefdoms. How has that happened, and are we immune or not?
No, we're not immune. It's happening here. There are a couple of reasons why we don't notice it. One is that Australia is so spread out that it's not right next to us. So the place that I lived in, Berlin, was literally 10 minutes walk from where I later moved to, which was very white, and you would never have known all of those things. But because things are closer together, you see it more. Now, in Australia, of course, it's a 40-minute drive before you come from, the centre of Sydney, say, before you get to a place like that. So we don't see that. The other issue is that I think we were very good at integration for many years. So Australia had a very thoughtful integration program, which was sort of built up during the 30s to answer the difficult question of how on earth you should integrate these brown southerners from Europe, these Italians and Spaniards and Greeks who were coming. And people at the time were worried that they might not integrate well with the northern Europeans who were there. And so there was a lot of thinking at the time about how to do that well. Now, John Howard actually the Prime Minister John Howard carried through that tradition in his long prime ministership. And
this was in the 90s and 2000s.
That's right, 90s and 2000s, and talked about how to ensure that people integrate by not funding ethnic community organisations, which then created leaders who had a financial interest in keeping their communities separate. So Howard was all about community integration. Obviously, work is an integrator, but so are sports clubs, so are all kinds of social institutions. And the more people have to themselves invest in those in a voluntary capacity, the more they work for integration. So Australia was slow in getting to the integration problem that the rest of the world, or that, certainly Europe has at the moment.
You mean the problem was slow in developing here, not we were slow at addressing it?
Exactly.
Right.
We are 10 years behind the European problem in this. I used to think 20 years behind, but recent events I've sort of spent a bit more time in some of those areas where this is happening, and I've revised my ideas.
By recent events, do you mean terrorism and
the terror attack in Bondi, but also the response to October 7, the fact that people became very ethnically tribal, and not just ethnically but religiously tribal following that event, showed that there is less integration in Australia than you might think when you spend time in the middle of Sydney, even some of the sort of outer suburbs. But if you go further out, you'll see people who just are there is no longer any deliberate thinking about how to bring them into the mainstream of society and to bring them together under a shared culture.
It's been eye-opening, hasn't it, the past couple of years in ways that make me depressed, but also maybe optimistic that it's at least alerting us to the problem before it's too late. I always used to take the kids more when they were more little to there's a big playground out at Olympic Park, which is where the Sydney hosted the Olympics in the year 2000. It's much closer to areas that are heavily Muslim and Arab than where I live. And I used to get such a kick out of the kids being the only non-Muslims playing there, and, whole families picnicking, and, it's not like the women are wearing burqas, but they're just wearing headscarves. And I used to feel this great sort of multicultural comity in my sort of progressive lefty way. And after October 7th and seeing the uniformity of rage and sort of semi-sympathy for jihadists from large swathes of that community, I did then, it tainted it a bit, because I would stand there in the sunshine looking at all these families thinking, if they knew I was a Jew, how would they treat me? Would they still smile at me? Like, is this just a one-way sense of comity?
And that is what we're now wondering in a lot of countries around the world. And of course, the answer is there is no uniform answer.
No, and many of them I would like to believe, would still see my humanity as well. But yes, whatever we can do to make sure that we turn the volume up on that. And down on tribal dogmatism.
Right. And that's why I think we have to be really thoughtful about integration. I think we have to do it deliberately. I think we have to acknowledge that Australia is an immigration nation and that is a wonderful thing. But the reason that we've got such a great immigration nation is because it was done deliberately. Now, I think it was the late 90s. I was only half tuned into politics at that age. I remember there was a debate about multiculturalism. There were the people in favour of it, and then John Howard, the Prime Minister at the time, said, no, we are multi-ethnic, but we have a shared culture. That debate was won by the multiculturalists, by the idea that, no, we have to celebrate all of these different cultures, and what even is, why should we have one particular culture? What makes one culture better than the other? It was the height of relativism at the time. They won. So now we've got the problems that come from that particular strain of thinking in society. We are no longer thinking the reason that Australia is great is because we share a set of values. And, you can have your different backgrounds, you can have, your different practices. You can be Buddhist, you can be whatever. But at the end of the day, we're here in the country together working on a society which has shared values and a shared idea of what it means to be one place.
Yeah, and I mean the great danger, of course, in not having that as a founding fundamental approach to our sort of demos is that people crave that.
Yeah.
And so if you don't give it to them, then they're going to seek it in perverse and distorted ways like the far right. I mean, to lefties who really don't want the far right to get power, the surest way to empower the far right is to claim that anyone who thinks that there should be a universal shared set of values is just a white supremacist bigot.
That's right. That's right. How to alienate people in one idea.
Yeah, exactly. How do you feel about America? Because I mean, the interesting thing about the States is that, like, as Ronald Reagan said in his final speech as president, I think, you can't go to, there are very few countries that you can go to and just become a fully fledged member of that country. It's like we were talking about the Turks in Germany. You can come to America regardless of where you are, what your cultural background is, and you can become an American just by signing up to a set of ideas, which is not true of the French or the Japanese or whatever. Do you have a sense from your understanding of the States about whether or not that is sustainable and how they've done that so well, and we can learn?
I think for the US it worked out really well for a long time as well. So essentially in Anglophone countries around the world, immigration has worked better than in other countries, and there are a couple of reasons for that. I can't remember the source of this study, but I do remember it very clearly, is the reason is, or at least the theory was, that people go to Anglophone countries from whichever country they come from because they're likely to have learned English at school, and if they want to make something of themselves, if they really back themselves, then Anglophone countries are their first choice because that's where they can fit into business, make a business, or become part of society. And then the other countries, the other flip side of that coin is that a lot of the Scandinavian countries and Germany and countries like France and so on have a big welfare culture. So people who don't back themselves are then more attracted to the welfare culture. And you do see a little bit of that. Now, I think where America really succeeded was that it was the land of hope for people to come to it. And integration is fundamentally the first unit of integration is a job, is becoming, working with other people of that country. So America worked extremely well like that for a long time. I think that then, however, there are a number of factors where almost, bleeding heart lefties often make stupid mistakes when out of the very best of intentions, but, just not thinking through the second and third order consequences of what they're doing. And so trying to create better conditions for people, trying to create, to ensure that nobody is left hungry and poor and so on, accidentally dismantle the very thing that led people to have successful, satisfying, and shared lives. So,
which is what exactly, if you had to articulate it?
So I mean, simply sometimes welfare measures can backfire like that. So you will, first of all, you can attract people who are deliberately coming because they think that this is the land of plenty and that everything's free. Australia certainly has that issue, and then. Also, as I say, with work being the first unit of integration, if you are not putting that first, then you're actually keeping people locked out of society. You know, of course it's hard moving countries. Like, immigration is really hard. Even for me, moving to Germany, it was hard. And, you know, I have a German passport and I speak German, or at least...
Also, you were in the German Greens, so when you say that, you know, bleeding heart lefties sometimes feel that way, was your political transformation...
I wasn't in the Greens. I did some work for them.
Okay, but I mean affiliated with. Like, you know, you don't go and work for people who you fundamentally disagree with. So was that transformation... Was that a political transformation on the basis of the way that you saw opportunity versus welfarism?
Again, I was young, I needed the money. So that was probably the first and foremost, the reason for doing that work. But no, I did believe in what they were talking about at the time, which was, ironically, after everything I've just been saying, open borders. So, but I think also the Greens in Germany back then were what you would call the Realos. It was the sort of the pragmatic end of the party. And they seemed kind of economically ambitious for Germany. It brought together things that I believed in, you know, the well-being of people, that we should be working to make a better society and people, you know, give people a more satisfying existence, and the naivety of youth and, you know, just simply wanting the cash.
Okay, well, good reasons. I mean, another reason that occurs to me why Anglophone countries might do immigration better than non-Anglophone countries is that all the Anglophone countries, with the exception of the UK and Ireland, are new countries anyway. So they're all migrant. I mean, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the United States, right? And in fact, you would argue that migration has probably worked better in those countries than it has in the UK. Which is
that's a very
older
good point.
and has, you know, it means something to be English in a cultural way that it doesn't mean something to be Australian or Canadian or American.
That's getting back to the point that you're making before. You can become Australian, you can become American in a way that you can't become a nationality which has existed for a long, long time and has deep cultural
It's hard to
roots.
Become Scottish.
Yeah,
you know,
that's right.
If you're not Scottish.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's talk about young people and the 6 tribes that you're identifying here, because I think this will, you know, overlap onto a lot of what we're talking about here. Well, I was staggered in your report to see that young people today are the most depressed. I don't know if we're talking about clinical depression, but the most negative.
That's right. They're the most miserable, essentially.
Most miserable group.
They start life, and this is not from my study. But they start life as unhappy as people used to get in middle age, or as we now get in middle age. I don't know, but it's sort of. But so they are starting off much unhappier. And of course, one of the great questions is, does this mean they're going to get even unhappier as they hit middle age? Because that is the typical U curve, is that people become unhappy and then they get happier again at the other end as their responsibilities wane and so on.
Right. So normally you're happy when you're young, healthy, full of sex and like don't have any responsibility.
That's right.
And then you get all the responsibilities of middle age and parenting and mortgages and become a bit less happy, and then you're unburdened again and become happy.
Exactly.
But they're starting at the bottom. That's right. They're starting really low. So that's a real issue. And it's happening in Australia and around the world. So this is in the US, in the UK, all of those places as well. In fact, all developed countries, this study covered. And of course, we've got to look into what's going on there. So, you know, why are young people so unhappy? The other big question that I think is worth asking is why sorry, I've lost my completely lost my train of but so that was one of the that's right. And so that was one of the questions I wanted to answer. The other one that I'm worried about is democratic disillusionment. So, you know, studies of young people increasingly show that they don't back democracy. They don't believe in it. They don't think, you know, they don't tend to the, you know, best system of any other, even if it's not perfect, kind of Churchill view. The worst system.
the worst
apart
system.
From all the others,
apart from all the
Churchill
others.
Said,
That's the one.
yes.
That's the one. And that is a real problem because we are a liberal democratic society, and that means something. It means that we get to vote for a set of circumstances, and we believe that our vote will change things. And I think that what came out of the research that I've done is that young people no longer believe that they have the ability to change things. So the top line finding, and there's lots of deep research in there because I used a Pew-style sort of division of way of looking at the values and behaviours and attitudes of people to segment people into tribes. But the insight that allowed at the top line is that people who feel like they have control over their lives have higher life satisfaction than people who don't feel like they have control over their lives, who have very low satisfaction. And only 4 out of 10 young Australians between 18 and 34 years old believe that they have control over their circumstances.
4 out of 10 say they control their circumstances. That's amazing. Right. I remember a clinical psychologist explaining to me once, like, spheres of control, these sort of concentric rings of control, right? The bullseye in the middle being things that you have total control over, like whether or not you walk out of this interview right now, whether or not you eat breakfast or whatever. And then at the far end, outside ring is, climate chaos, the war in Iran, and so on and so forth. And making the point, sort of channeling Jonathan Haidt, I suppose, and our information consumption, that the more time you spend in a further out circle, the less happy you are. And the more time your mind spends on things that are within your power, generally the more content
And I think the argument that was out of that, I can't remember where it was from, was that liberals spend more time in the outer circles.
And are less
people
happy.
On the left, that's right.
Yes, whereas, a religiously conservative family in, the Midwest of the United States is going to spend a lot of time thinking about the church bake-off and thinking about their school's little league and things over which they control and contribute, and that we've been migrating psychologically from the center to the periphery of those rings over time.
It's a really interesting point. It's not borne out. Well, sorry, I'm not saying that that's wrong. I think that can be true, but they're also not always the groups who are not feeling in control in my research. So you definitely do have that in one group. So I segmented them into 6 groups. We've got what I gave them these names. So.
Yes, I love the I love the florid. I've got them written down here. Yes, I love the florid terms. So let's go through them.
I had acronyms to begin with, but these are probably so I had progressive identitarians. Now, those are the people who you're talking about, the left in the sort of outer concentric circles.
They're far lefty.
They're far left.
LGBTQIA plus.
That's right. 40% of them identify as LGBTQIA+.
Incredible.
And which is huge. That's right. So the average in the age group is about 10%. So they skew the entire age group, if you look at them in the aggregate.
Did you do any digging into what they mean by LGBTQIA+?
No, we didn't do that.
Because I'd be interested to know how many of them are actually have non-heterosexual.
Straights?
Yeah, well, exactly. How many of them are non-heterosexuals versus how many of them are just expressing sort of linguistic solidarity with an idea of queerness?
I suspect that you've hit on something there. So, I mean, a friend of mine likes to call them spicy straights. The people who find it's too boring to describe themselves as heterosexual, so they'll say I'm queer, but in fact they've only ever had heterosexual relationships.
Or they're gender non-conforming.
Yeah, that's
so
right.
It's a guy who wears a dress but sleeps with women, and all of a sudden he's...
Exactly. So I think there's a lot in that because they're very identity focused, which is why I called them identitarians, progressive identitarians. Okay. So they're sort of, they think about identity across all kinds of other vectors as well. But they tend to be students. So, you see that education component. They tend to either still be living at home with their parents or renting. But what you see is that these people have a very low sense of control over their aspirations and being able to achieve what they want to achieve in life. And they've given up. They've given up entirely. They focus on short-term goals instead, and which is, but they're not happy. So we're seeing high anxiety in this group, low sense of control, low life satisfaction. So that's the concentric circle you were talking about. But then you've got 2 groups who, in the old days, they might have even been both sort of the conservatives. And one of them that I find is really interesting what I originally called the Linders, but they're
The leaders?
The Linders, which
the
was
Linders.
yes, because I don't know, for some reason that name just summed it up for me. But then in the final wash, I called them the dislocated post-traditionalists, which is a bit of a mouthful. But the reason I did that is because there's a clue in there, and I'll tell you what their characteristics are, and then I'll tell you what I was thinking. So these are young women who have children but are not married. So they tend to be in de facto arrangements. There is a man around, but as I found out in Qual, there are often a couple of fathers to the children. They don't have degrees, and they have these sort of situations which have evolved. They are desperately unhappy, and they feel very out of control. They're ready to burn the world down in terms of, in their voting. Like, they are not happy and don't feel represented in politics at all. Now, the reason I called them dislocated post-traditionalists is because you look at these young women and you think, in the past, perhaps pre-sexual revolution, these are women who would have followed the traditional pathway. They would have gotten married young to some guy who, fell in love with them, couldn't resist them at the time. They would have had a family. And they might not have had the happiest marriage ever, but they would have had a satisfaction. It would have been a stable life. Now they have a very unstable life because the men are not sticking around. They're not marrying them. It's hard to be a young woman without a degree and with children. And there's a lot of misery in there. So I think that they are people who would have influenced their direct environment, but some social things are now beyond their control. And then you've got the young men, they tend to be young men, so I called them natals. And
natals? As in birth?
Sort of that's right, exactly. So these are they tend to identify as far right, but they're anti-immigration, they're worried about crime, they're very proud of the nation.
Oh, right. Natal in terms of blood and soil?
Exactly. That's that's the direction I was thinking.
Yeah.
And they're also very annoyed because they feel like things are out of control. They can't stop the government making decisions which are going very wrong in their opinion. They also want to burn down the world, so they don't feel represented. And, in Australia, we've recently seen the rise of Pauline Hanson's One Nation, a party which people consider to be far right and populist. And these guys were already voting in that direction or already leaning in that direction. I reckon they've been joined by the young women who already feel like the world is burning down.
Interesting.
And they would easily, not feeling well represented, come over to a view like that. Because while in the past they've voted left or identify as green, actually their values...
This is the Linders,
That's
mean?
right, the Linders, the dislocated post-trats.
Yeah.
Their values don't align with the Green Party
right.
or with left voting. So
they're not choosing LGBTQIA plus out of solidarity.
Not at all. They're worried about energy sovereignty. They don't think that Australia should be signing up to international climate treaties. And so insofar as they think about these things, that's their values don't align with this sort of left liberal approach at all. So so I think that those are the really low agency people. Then you get...
Just before we move on to the three higher agency and maybe less anxious groups, let's just dig into those two because I think that's really interesting, especially the dislocated post-traditionalists and the natals. There's good reasons why the dislocated post-traditionalists, let's just call them the Linders for the purposes of brevity. They have more legitimate reason to be anxious and depressed than, for example, the progressive identitarians, right? The progressive identitarians might be spending all of their time in the farthest ring of the sphere of control, worrying about, why Trump and Israel are being so mean to everybody. But if you're an uneducated single mother with kids from several different guys working a few jobs, then life genuinely is objectively as hard for you as it is for anybody in society,
that's right.
Probably. So you mentioned earlier that, you write a lot about feminism and about the sexual revolution. Can you just expand on the plight of that particular group in light of
So
those themes?
Yeah, I look, and this is now synthesizing sort of a lot of work that I've done, not just these guys. My observation has been that many young women have been the losers of the sexual revolution. It's almost, I hate to say this, but it's almost on an IQ scale. So, women smart women who can make decisions about their future, frankly, have a longer attractiveness span to men. They can make decisions. They see the bigger picture. They are like Germaine Greer, the great feminist. A classic example of a winner of the sexual revolution. She had a wonderful life, enjoying sex, getting out there, like having a marvelous time. And men fell madly in love with her because she was a bright, sparky, wonderful woman, so irresistible to a certain type of man. At the other end of the spectrum, you have people who, are probably like, they're not the brightest, but that's fine. They also deserve a good life, right? But they're never going to be out there writing, manifestos about feminism. What happened was that when the sexual revolution came along and marriage was no longer something that you had to do if you knocked somebody up, So first of all, pregnancy was all of a sudden a decision that could be made, and marriage as a result became something that wasn't an obligation for men who got a woman pregnant. These women lost out because there was no longer the classic trajectory. It's not like they felt like they didn't want children anymore. In fact, for those women, a lot of the time, children are the meaning of life. And this is, you really heard this in my research. So in the qualitative, they talked about this a lot. The children are really, really important to them. And in fact, in some other anthropological studies, they found that they're the status for these women. So,
Right.
So that is how they find their meaning.
Yep.
But because the men aren't sticking around, or the men who they know are also low quality, so marrying one of these guys means potentially shackling yourself to somebody who's not working, who's not contributing in the household, who's just essentially just another mouth to feed. So that's a miserable time. And what you end up with is people who really could have had, as I say, maybe not ecstatically happy, but very satisfying lives if they had followed the traditional life path of getting married early, having a bunch of kids, then having a bunch of grandkids. They would have ended up very satisfied.
Is that not also partly caused by the dysfunction of men? In the sense
absolutely.
Like it used to be a requirement that the male would, either step up and get a job and control his drinking and not beat his wife, at least in too obvious a manner, or he'd be excluded from polite society.
Exactly. So the sexual revolution has failed men in a less visible but just as deep way. And that is precisely, as you say, these guys would also have ended up much happier. Because they might feel now that that would have been entrapping them if they'd had to marry or something like that. But again, sometimes these situations, a family is a wonderful thing. It gives you meaning. It gives you stability. It simply is more important than a job which you do just for money, but the family you do out of love and for purpose. So it's a really important unit of society, which once again, wealthy people have now figured this out. And so wealthy people are getting married at higher rates than they were for many years. But poorer people haven't. They were told you do it this way by the wealthy people who are busy, having the time of their lives. But nobody sent them the memo. What turns out we've worked out that our happiness comes from having a family as well. And that's something that we'd recommend to everybody. Influencers are still about, you have to, you have your big freedom. And, now there's this thing on TikTok about how it's embarrassing to have a boyfriend, and stuff like that. And I'm like, well, you know what? But I'm really happy for you getting all the clicks and watches and views from all of that stuff. But the message is wrong. It's making people miserable. And so that's, as a society, we've really got to think about what sort of things we tell people. It's like the myth that babies are no fun. Of course they're hard work. But, this is it's like there's been a concerted PR campaign.
Trust me, babies are not fun. Having had, there's the father of 8-year-old twins. I love them now, and I did not like them when they were 6 months old. But
okay, I'm just going to insert something there. It's a little bit different for women because our bodies get addicted to them. So there are hormones that course through us when they're babies, which are like drugs of addiction. It's literally, so you get a dopamine hit, so you get addicted to your baby. And when the cuddles give you that rush. And so this is why women also can't stand being very far from their babies when they're in that early time, because your body is just primed to get the rush from the hormones. So it's,
I can imagine the liberationist feminist who thinks you're a traitor to feminism, right? Responding to this
dozens of them
critique by saying, and I don't think it's entirely misguided. We created we empowered people to be able to make more choices about how they wanted to live their lives. And what happened was men decided to piss it all up against the wall and do whatever the hell they wanted to. And that leaves women, we're talking about these men, right? We're talking about the men who are more prone to domestic violence, alcoholism, and walking and irresponsible fatherhood. And that's the cohort from which these women now have to, who are essentially blameless, now have to pick.
That's right.
So, yes, there are problems with liberationist feminism, but it's not a problem of women. It's a problem of the fact that men have screwed it up and they're being assholes.
I would 100% agree with that. That's the thing, that in taking away that sort of that pathway as an inevitability, a lot of men have fallen into being miserable, which is also not great. So I'll tell you about
But they might even be happy dickheads. I mean, some of them might just be assholes who are perfectly happy being assholes, and they can get away with it now, and they couldn't have.
You can get satisfaction from video games. You can get satisfaction from porn and all of those sorts of things. But is it the kind of satisfaction that leaves you happy in old age? I don't know. Look, honestly, I don't know. I can't tell you the answer to that. But I can tell you that there was another cohort in my research, which the only reason they're not in the very low control end of things is because they don't think about things a great deal. And so I called them the detached, and they're sort of, she'll be right, it'll all work out. But here is the thing that came through with them was that they really wanted a relationship, but they think that's the hardest thing to achieve. They don't know how to achieve it. So here is a cohort of men who are being failed by society, which sends funky messages about where you're going to get your satisfaction from. So they are, they're really not tuned in. But
so
they're also not
detached, these are single males,
so they're detached both socially in terms of their thinking about issues, but also detached in terms of relationship. But 70% of them want a relationship.
Got it.
It's a huge thing for them, but they think that it's going to be hard to achieve and they haven't got it. But it keeps on coming up, whereas everything else in their stats is like they've just ticked the dunno button.
Right.
They're
not politically engaged.
That's right. They're not thinking about ideas.
They're generally employed, are they?
They're not more unemployed than other
norm.
cohorts.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they want a relationship and they want a family, but they can't find one.
That's right. So that's what really comes through on those guys.
Yeah.
And I think the only reason they're not in the low control side of things is because they just don't think about things enough. So
the bliss of being ignorant, I suppose.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah. So they're all
How does the manosphere factor into all this? There's a lot of fretting at the moment after the Louis Theroux documentary and, about the sort of dysfunction of toxic masculinity. I've had debates with, Clementine Ford on this show about what I regard as being a certain unseemly stridency in her, she's an Australian feminist for people who don't know, in her sort of narrative of, kill all men and all men have to, all men are bastards. And I'd rather be chased by a bear than walk through a city street at night and be subjected to men. And this kind of sort of easy, slightly twee group demonization has, I think, then fed into some of the dysfunction, which is not to excuse the dysfunction, but just to explain it. The dysfunction of young men in becoming highly misogynistic and sometimes highly traditional family values oriented as well. How does that overlay onto these groups and onto the struggles of feminism that you were talking about?
So I think you see it in the natals a bit, but the attitudes that strongly pro-family.
The natals are the far-right male
guys,
blood and
that's
soil.
Right. Yeah, but
blokes.
You know what? I think that it overlays on society more broadly. Like there is a certain cohort of young men who feel very lost, and they also feel very insulted. So, you go online and there is a lot of content about how awful men are, how they're toxic, how you'd rather be in the woods with a bear and all of that stuff. And that creates that sense of being vilified, not being part of things. And I actually think it makes things much worse. So young men start to feel like, well, I can't win. Nobody's going to give me a break. They're assuming bad things about me. And if they don't have good role models, if they don't have a stable upbringing, then they might go in that direction. It's sort of saying, well, I will, treat women in this awful way, or they fall into the trap of these manosphere influencers who, at the positive end of the scale, it's sort of the Jordan Peterson make your bed end, which is quite a good message for a young man who's never had any real discipline in his life, is get your own shit sorted out before you worry about other people's. And at the other end is in the sort of weird men proving themselves by having multiple partners, by doing all of these, by investing in crypto and all of these things, which are, once again, they're not necessarily going to lead to happiness. So, I watched that Thoreau documentary the other day with my son, actually, my 13-year-old son.
Right.
And we both came out of it going, well, that's. I said to him, "Have you seen these people online?" He said, "Oh yeah, I recognised a couple of them, but he said, they sort of glance off me. It's not really the stuff that is in my feed all the time, and I don't believe them." And I thought, well, possibly one of the reasons you don't believe them is because you're from a happy household where, people rib each other all the time, but we're basically, but you can see what it looks like when people love one another and support one another, and that's a pretty good sort of arrangement to be.
Yeah, I mean, and he also has a first-hand experience of a very powerful and smart woman in his life, in the form of you. So it's not, I mean, I do think there's a problem of having fallen through the cracks for a lot of these guys, which Louis didn't get to, that I would have liked if in the final 20 minutes or a half hour he'd been able to reckon with why are so many young people attracted to these messages other than just, it's algorithms and crypto and everyone wants to be big and strong and rich? Because there is the Jordan Peterson, Scott Galloway, Chris Williamson message of self-improvement and boys have it tough, and it doesn't detract from the needs of girls and women to say so and to worry about masculinity, and it's unhelpful to talk about masculinity as only being something that's toxic. That message has been hijacked by these dickheads because the rest of us haven't really been able to talk about it in a rational way for fear of sounding like we're misogynists.
Yeah, and I think there's that's exactly it, because we can't talk about this rationally, but also because I'm afraid it is the algorithm. So young people now see a lot of messages about each other, but they're not doing as much talking to one another. And so,
do you mean face to face or even virtually?
That's right.
Yeah.
Sort of talking to one another face to face. So you learn about how to approach a girl from the internet, but it's being taught to you by somebody who has no idea themselves about how to actually fall in love.
Yeah.
So, and it's the same with girls, though. This is the really important thing about women and men going in opposite directions politically. I think what's happening is that they're inhabiting different universes and they're being told conflicting messages about each other. So when you come together, as eventually, hopefully you might, you've got a whole wrong set of ideas about who the other person is, what they want out of life, how to get it, and also just how to interact as a normal human being. There's been this othering that happens as a result of the online behaviour. So I think we've got a real issue that we need to confront there, and that there is a lot of responsibility and culpability in online, online posters who pull people apart like that. So, I mean, I do think that there needs to be more confrontation of that, including more confrontation of Clementine Ford and her awful messages, which, as you say, they push boys into thinking women just hate us. And so that pushes them towards the manosphere rather than pulling them away from it. And at the same time, she's pulling girls into this space of thinking that men are terrible and toxic and should be treated poorly as a result.
Yeah. It's interesting how many female friends of mine there was a sort of eruption about maybe 2 years ago or 18 months ago of women's opposition to domestic violence. I think there was a spate of domestic violence killings in Australia, and remember there were some rallies about it, and there was a real assumption from some of my female friends who were quite shocked, who would ask me whether or not, when guys are alone and we're all talking in private, like, do we make jokes about that? And if someone was to admit that they'd been violent to their girlfriend, like, would we just fob it aside? And maybe I'm in a privileged community, but like, that is a complete no-go for, like, I wouldn't want the impression that young women have to be that actually secretly guys don't really give a shit about violence against women. Because that is Waleed Ali, my friend, had a good piece in the Herald and the Age about this at the time, saying he feels about that the same way that he feels about terrorism and Muslims, because he's a Muslim. And like, when a group that you feel is part of your identity gets blamed collectively for something that you can't even conceive of doing, it's actually not constructive to helping you be part of the solution. And when all men are kind of assumed to be morally culpable for some asshole who beats his wife, it's actually, it is less
exactly. It drives
conducive.
People away rather than pulling them together. I mean, I do think there is an issue, and I do think I'm a bit obsessed with the sexual revolution, but I do think that we do again have to talk about sort of how people interact, and possibly there is a bit of I suppose, forgetting how to deal with one another, the lack of models of conflict, even of healthy conflict within a relationship, leads to people having unhealthy conflict in it. But also, it has been hard for some men to see women overtake them in the workforce, in education, and so on. And one of the statistics that you say is men whose wives out-earn them are more likely to be violent. I think that probably the context of that is when the relationship dynamics have started out the other way around, with the man higher status, and the woman overtakes him. Some men don't know how to deal with that. And might feel resentful, feel like their manhood is undermined. Now, that is something, once again, that we have to look at from a social perspective. No amount of government policy can fix that sort of thing. We have to, as a society, so we've got to talk about this, and we've got to also explain that it is fine for, if a woman is out earning you, like, you should be happy about that. Like,
it's free money for the household.
That's right, exactly.
I mean, he probably feels like a failure as well, so then he lashes out because he's got low self-esteem or whatever.
Oh, that's right.
Knows?
I imagine it's something along those lines. Plus, learning how to have healthy conflict is really important. I think that watching your parents argue but not argue meanly is probably a useful lesson. So the worst thing that can happen in a couple is contempt. But disagreement is going to happen. If you see how people resolve conflict, for me, my mother used to storm off and go for a drive, actually probably just go for a glass of wine with her friend. And my dad would read to me and calm it all down. And then, at some point she'd storm back in and then kind of, have a talk about it that day or the next day or whatever and sort it out. But there was, the arguments were big and explosive. And of course, as a child, it's a bit scary sometimes as well. But seeing the conflict resolution was also really important. So that's okay. You can be angry with your spouse.
Yes, I mean that's an incredibly thorny cultural and social thing to foster, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, either you've got that skill or you don't. It's hard to know how you would set the policy dials or anything to encourage that.
Exactly.
So the six tribes. So we've got our progressive identitarians, the far left queer tree hugging, people. We've got the dislocated post-traditionalists, which is the Lindas, the low education, distrustful, anxious single mothers, the natals, the far right, anti-immigrant. Aussie blood and soil types. Now we've got the detached who are detached from politics and big issues and sort of she'll be right and they're single, can't find a girlfriend but want a family. The final two are...
So the final two is what I call the strivers, which sort of speaks for itself. They plan to work really hard. They believe that they're going to be able to make a go of it. But it's not a sure thing. There is no money from family. There is, they're essentially building a life off the sweat of their own back. And they have hope. And that makes a big difference in people's lives because if you believe that you can influence the barriers that you face, then you're much more likely to be able to influence them than if you don't believe that. So these people, and luckily they are the largest group, but only by a small margin, they believe that they are going to be able to get ahead in life. They still want all of the traditional things, which most of these groups want, by the way, financial security, home ownership and a family, which across all of the cohorts are more or less agreed as, that's the definition of success. And so they're working towards that. It was a pleasure writing them up. You're really rooting for them. And then you've got the head starts, I called them. So this group skews male, tends to either expect to inherit money from family or already has, so will receive significant financial assistance.
The Nepo babies.
What's that?
The Nepo babies, we call them. Yeah.
That's right, exactly. And, it's only a small group, unfortunately, but these guys are doing really well. They often... I'm
happy that it's a small group. I don't want a whole bunch of Nepo babies. I like the strivers. I want people who are doing it through the grit of their own gumption.
You do really root for the strivers. But look, it was also a pleasure writing up the head starts, honestly, after the depressing experience of going through the others, because so they're getting this money that they're also they're hard workers, right? But they often already have a family, have already got a mortgage on a house. So
mum and dad gave them a deposit for a home.
That's right. They've so they've got a good education, they've got a good job, they've got a foot on the property ladder. Things are going to work out for them, and so. The interesting thing about this group, though, I found was while they say that they sort of consider themselves centrist with an equal number distributing also on the left and the right, overall, they are actually quite redistributionist, which is interesting. So these are people for whom life has really worked out and they're a long way from the Lindas, and they believe that in welfare, they believe in redistribution, all of these things. They are not bad people.
They're Chardonnay socialists, as we might call them.
They're genuinely good people who want the best for people. But the interesting thing is in the difference here of the attitudes of those people towards international climate treaties, welfare, all of these things, and the attitudes of the dislocated post-traditionalists, the Lindas, who actually think that welfare can do more harm than good, who are worried that that government money is being spent on the wrong things, who are worried about the international climate treaties. So that's your sort of, your polar opposite on these things. And it's interesting to see that for the groups where things are working out, who have a high sense of personal agency and so on, and who are the furthest away from where things go wrong, they're the ones who come up with the solutions that end up doing harm. At least.
I mean, the devil's advocate, that wouldn't it be the case that if you really dug into what the Lindas are saying, they're not saying that they don't want help. They're saying that the help is not getting to them in the way that they would like. They're probably spending too long on the phone to Centrelink to get their welfare. The NDIS is too difficult to navigate.
You're completely right. They're not saying that they don't want help. What they are saying, however, is that they are worried that welfare does more harm than good. And part of that, of course, is when you live in a milieu like that, you see how it affects people. You see the bad effects of it. And this comes back to my time in Berlin. This is what I realized at the time, was that it's very easy when things are going well for you, you don't see these people, to think, oh, well, welfare is a lovely thing. Everybody should be entitled to everything. We just want to help them out, human dignity and all of that. But you can actually rob people of their dignity, of their sense of humanity by giving them these welfare transfers. And that is what I think that these Lindas are observing in person. They're seeing how things can go wrong. But of course, if you ask them, do you want to give up your welfare, they would say, no, I can't afford to. I rely on it. And that is also fair enough, because that is how things have been set up, that they are dependent on this. If we were to just say overnight, well, you told us that, you're worried that welfare is doing more harm than good, and so we're just going to stop it, then we would be leaving these women without
anything.
Without anything at all.
And so just in terms of what we should make out of, the complexions of these 6 tribes and the impact that they might have on our political and cultural unity in an era of increasing polarization, we've got the Head Starts, the Nepo babies, right, who are the Chardonnay socialists. They're doing fine, and they want a big welfare state and to be generous. The latte sipping, lefty progressives. The Strivers, who are also doing okay, but they weren't born with a silver spoon in their mouth, I assume are more conservative, old school. Are they low tax?
They're also not really
small business
they're
people.
Not really terribly politically engaged.
Okay,
so
but if they had to vote, I'm just sort of trying to get to.
So they tend towards the major parties, but they are also very soft in their voting. That is that they could go either way with it. And of course, in Australia, with compulsory voting, the soft voters are really important, because everybody has to get out to vote. And so the people who make their decisions, on the day, they can influence the way things go, but they're not feeling politically represented. In fact, one of the things that this reminds you, and I mean, I wouldn't be, for anybody who's in America, I wouldn't be telling you anything you don't know, but this, for Australians, it should remind us how many people are politically disengaged. They are not thinking day to day about all of these political things. In fact, the only politically engaged tribes in this really are the progressive identitarians and the Head Starts. Oh, and the Natals. They're politically engaged, but angry politically engaged.
Yeah, so, right. And just to pause there, so the progressive identitarians, the green-haired queer lefties, they're politically engaged on the far left.
That's right.
The Head Starts, the Nepo babies, would be politically engaged on the centre left.
Look. They consider themselves centred, and we are self-identification for how you consider yourselves politically. And a good chunk, most of them, or the larger amount, considered themselves centre. Some said they were on the centre left, and some said they were on the centre right.
Okay.
But they tend to vote for major parties, which in Australia would, of course, mean switching between the Social Democratic Party and the slightly less Social Democratic Liberal Party.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And so, I'm trying to get to where the whole wheels fall off everything, and we see, for example, One Nation, the quote-unquote far-right party now out-polling the centre-right party. Then there's the Natals, obviously, the angry young blood and soil men. You are afraid that the Lindas, the women who society has forgotten, who've been, shat upon by perhaps the sexual revolution, perhaps domestic violence, perhaps partners, perhaps the breakdown of the family, perhaps the economy, that they could actually also fuel.
So I suspect that a lot of them would easily go over because they're also very soft in
to
their
the far
voting.
right.
That's right. And so they're looking for, if they were thinking about it, they'll be looking for somebody who they feel represents their concerns. And, one of the things that Pauline Hanson's One Nation has done very well is that it has made people like that feel heard. Because all of a sudden, they feel like they're not being well served by society. They're being left out. They've got very low trust in institutions. All of those things are being channeled by One Nation. But, frankly, look, we are, and numerically that would work out. Basically, the One Nation vote, if you just said, okay, the Natals and the Lindas are both voting for One Nation, numerically that would work out to about what One Nation is in the polls at the moment.
Right.
But the truth is it's probably not quite that neat. So I suspect that post the Bondi Beach terror attack, when all of a sudden a lot of Australians started looking around them and worrying about social cohesion, I think that you would probably find some of the strivers going into that bucket as well. All of a sudden, people are worried that there is something bigger in society that is contributing to obstacles and, and the social cohesion things, because the strivers are also a bit worried about crime and immigration, but they're not way worried about it, but, they're family oriented. And so these things are on their radar. So you'd get some people from those sort of groups saying, well, at least they seem to have a clear idea of what to do, or, at least I understand what they want to do. And so you'd see some little feathering like that.
So, all right, as someone who has worked for the Australian Liberal Party and with the German Greens, you're putting your consultant's hat on to sort of wrap us up here and tie it all up in a bow. What would you be doing if you wanted to shore up liberal democracy in the West to tie together these 6 groups of young people into some kind of common ground that prevents us from falling off a cliff?
Well, for me, the key thing is choice, agency, control. So as I say, the insight by comparing those groups was that the people who feel like they have a sense of agency, a sense of control over their own life, have higher life satisfaction, and those who don't have it have lower life satisfaction. So I think in order to strengthen liberal democracy, we need to bring people back into having a sense of agency over their own lives. And that means rethinking some of the policy, some of the ways that we approach policy. At the moment in Australia, the way that we do policy is essentially Band-Aids. If there's a problem on something, we create a handout for it, or some kind of discount, or some kind of, assistance for something. And
so if houses are too expensive, we have a first homeowners scheme where you get money from the government.
Exactly. Which, of course, though, what that has done is that money has then pushed up the price of houses overall. So a few people got them for, with that help, and now nobody can afford them from who was earning in that same amount. So these Band-Aids kind of end up narrowing people's choices instead of widening them. And so therefore they end up with people who have less of a sense of control over their own lives, and therefore feel miserable, have a lower life satisfaction. So I think that the first thing we should do is every single new policy should be put through the lens of, does this put agency into people's hands or take it away from them. And that means, again, it doesn't necessarily mean taking assistance away from them entirely. It's about how it's structured.
But isn't there, this is reminding me a bit of sort of Thatcher era reforms where in order to get people off dependency on welfare, you had to do sort of a work for welfare or, work for the dole, those kinds of things, which, correct me if I'm wrong, can sometimes have the perverse effect of overly bureaucratizing the system. And then there are so many compliance things that all of a sudden it doesn't really feel like agency to the person who now, in order to, talking about the Lindas, for example, now in order to get her child care subsidy, she has to go through all of these things to prove that she went to a certain number of job interviews and did a certain number of things, and then the process becomes, strips one of one's dignity and agency.
Well, we have that in Australia now.
Yeah,
we have
exactly. So aren't you sort of advocating for more of that burden on poor people?
No, I'm advocating that people should be able to take on more work, for instance, while they are getting a welfare payment. So we should be giving them the ability to start pulling themselves out of a circumstance like that without punishing them.
Right. So remove all the disincentives to people working.
Exactly.
Right.
And we've got a lot of these, because what happens when you have a lot of welfare in society, as Australia does, is you end up with a lot of welfare cliffs, where people do all of a sudden lose everything if they try something in the right direction. So we should be looking at that. How can we ensure that people don't fall off a cliff as soon as they start doing the right thing?
Sorry to interrupt, but not just for young people, but for old people as well.
Absolutely.
Like, you lose your old age pension if you start working. You should be encouraged to stay in the workforce as long as you can.
That's absolutely. Or, one of my favourite policies at the moment is the idea that the childcare subsidy should be available for, if a grandparent is working and can't afford to give up work, but the daughter or son needs help with childcare, that you should be able to give that grandparent some of the childcare subsidy.
Yeah, right.
Instead of that being anchored to a daycare centre where you essentially have to just drop off the kid and, pick it up at the end of the day, and goodness knows what happens while it's there.
Right.
So we should be thinking about policies which give people more flexibility and agency over how they live their lives.
Right. How can we locate the maximum amount of control at the individual level instead of with that in a bureaucracy?
Yeah.
We haven't even touched on the big thing which kept coming up for all of these groups, which is houses and house
it's huge.
prices. I did find it interesting that in your report you noted that home ownership is a symbol of agency. I wonder if we can I wonder if it's easier to grow out of that symbol than it is to bring house prices down.
I'm not sure that it is. I think there's some very deep psychology involved in home ownership. And just from my own personal experience, as soon as I was pregnant, I needed to nest. There is a deep...
But if you'd been able to sign a 10-year lease and you couldn't be evicted unless you did something terrible, like in the Netherlands or something, where nobody expects to own their own apartment, but you have rights.
I think that... So I've living in Germany, there are similar laws. You still don't have the same sense of security and ownership. And in Germany, you can even, you can decorate the apartment, you can put things into it and so on. But at the end of the day, it's not yours. It is not the locus, the centre, the sort of hearth around which everything can form. I really think that there is something that goes beyond policy here, and we're going back to our sort of evolutionary animal brains, that we feel like we need our own cave. We need something that we can protect, defend, and believe in. And housing is that. Interestingly, if you look into the research around housing, it doesn't independently make people happier. Probably because mortgage payments can be stressful, saving up for it can be stressful, all of that sort of thing. And yet it's still the top thing that people want. So far and away across all of the tribes, everybody said home ownership was a top goal.
Yeah, right.
except that the progressive identitarians think that it's absolutely impossible for them, so they've given up. But everybody else, that's the thing they want the most.
I wonder if it's also just fueled by a sense of the gross injustice about the intergenerational inequality there, and the fact that, everybody knows that their parents or grandparents bought a place for $30,000 in Surrey Hills that's now $4 million.
I do think there's a bit of that, and I do, but there is genuine injustice here. And think about it this way. So I used to hire a bunch of interns when I was running a company based in Darlinghurst in inner city Sydney. And these interns would be travelling 2 hours sometimes from Wollongong to Sydney to come to the job. And eventually it would become unsustainable for them. So what you see there is people being locked out of good jobs by housing affordability. So it's not just that they can't live in a place that they'd love to live, which, by itself is already a bit sad, but, oh, well, cry me a river. But there is something much more important. They're being locked out of good jobs.
Yeah, and that's terrible for everybody,
that's
not
right.
just for them. I mean, I had the chairman of the City of Sydney Committee for Sydney, Eamon Waterford, on the show, who was saying that when you have a city that is too expensive for a cleaner to live in, don't be surprised when you have a dirty, dysfunctional city.
That's right. Yeah,
what I mean? Like, it has to be affordable.
And this is where the older generations really are culpable, because I'm afraid there is the wonderful inner city suburb of Sydney, Potts Point, formerly King's Cross, used to be a red light district, used to be lots and lots of fun, is now inhabited by people who, are over the age of 40. You now can't get a meal or sometimes even a drink in that suburb after 9:30. It's dead. It's a wasteland. Now, there was other stuff that happened
because of rules about
simply because nobody's out.
Oh, right.
It's
well,
like
the lockout laws didn't help, I suppose, back in the day.
Help. You'll see the same thing in Surrey Hills. You'll see the same thing in a lot of other inner city locations, is that
because boring rich old people are there.
Boring rich old people own these places now, and they don't want to go out past.
Well, come out to the inner west where I live. We're still rocking. We've got young families going out.
Well, and so this is what you actually do see in sort of satellite suburbs. So one of my hobbies is I like to go out with a friend and we'll have dinner in a different Sydney suburb each week.
Yeah, great.
So there's a suburb called Toongabbie with a high Sri Lankan population. Fabulous Sri Lankan food.
Excellent.
Another one is Harris Park, high Indian population.
Yep.
Very fun. Like, it's open until midnight on a weeknight. Everybody's out on the street having a marvelous time, because the populations are younger.
Yeah.
It's not because they're, suddenly somehow more fun people. They're just younger. They don't have responsibilities yet like other people do. And so however, what has happened with our cities is that young people are locked further and further out. And the reason that is because the older people there not only say, well, we want to stay here because it's awesome living in our inner city suburb, but they also then complain about any development around there. So they won't let new houses be built near them because, gosh, it might compromise their housing values, or, you wouldn't want to ruin their amenity. Well, you can't have all of those things and grandchildren in a city, so you're going to eventually just kill a city by aging it. Now, I don't know what's going to happen to our commerce eventually, because eventually it will happen that you won't even be able to get young workers into the city. They won't be able, or it'll be.
Well, we're just going to have to build a bunch more apartments on the, on the inner rings of the city.
But again, the apartments are great when you're starting out. They're not great when you're thinking of a family.
No, that's true.
Yeah.
But I mean, you go to George Street on a, the main street of the central business district of Sydney on a Friday or Saturday night, and it's humming. I mean, it is very alive, and it's all young Asian students who live in apartments nearby. They do supply nightlife.
That's absolutely right. And and you do want people to have a place to start out. You've got to be able to live nearby. And I think one of the things that Australia does very, very poorly is build up areas like that in an aesthetically pleasing sort of a way. There's a whole strip from the Sydney CBD going up to Paddington, which is big nightlife strip, Oxford Street. But it's 2-story.
Yeah.
There are no,
Yeah.
it should be 6
And it's
stories.
ugly as all hell.
That's right. There should be 6-story
Yeah.
buildings there where
So
people can live.
we have to go, but just coming back to the first thing that you were talking about, the happiness curve, right? And, the question of whether or not these 6 groups of the under 35s are going to get even unhappier into middle age or not. What's your crystal ball say? Like, are the kids going to be all right?
I am worried. I think that unless the economy improves and it's not showing any signs of going in the right direction, these young people aren't miraculously going to become happier. So the thing that gives people hope is a strong, vigorous economy, because you make your decisions long term when you're young. Even if you don't realize it, you sort of, when you have your first baby, you're making a certain statement about what you think is going to happen in your life. When you have your second baby, you're making a statement about how much it cost you to have your first one and whether this is a sustainable sort of approach to life. So I think that I don't see things turning around unless Australia is able to turn its economy around and become a prosperous nation again with great prospects. There's no reason we shouldn't be able to do that.
I mean, I would quibble that we're not prosperous.
Well, okay, we are prosperous, but we're heading in the wrong direction. We are spending too much on the credit card above our means, and that means that we're saddling young people with more and more debt. And while they might like the individual handouts, they're not going to like the debt, and they will respond to it consciously or unconsciously with the decisions that they make in life, and those decisions are what make you happy or unhappy. Already one of the things I say is that a lot of people saying they don't think they're going to be able to afford as many kids as they want.
On that cheerful note, thanks for bringing me down, Parnell. Lovely to talk to you.
Lovely to be here. Thanks so much for having me.